Hi, Andrew Cuneo here with another video. This time it's going to be going into Historic with some of the new alchemy changes. I'm going to go over the version of White Weenie I like in Historic. And this is a deck that most of the time people will play splashing green for Collected Company and sometimes this card Hamlet Vanguard. Which is another benefit for being a human. I'm choosing not to do that because I want to have a lower curve. And I also feel like with Collected Company, it makes some amount of sense to play, but if you look at the way most of those white-green decks are constructed, there's like plenty of good 3-drops they're not even playing. There's so many good 3-mana options in white that I think you can just cut a color out of your deck and just play more good 3-drops and not play Collected Company. You get less upside for sure by doing that, but what you get out of that is way better mana. You're only playing, lands of one color. You don't have to play any lands that are going to come into play tapped ever, which those white-green decks, they play Temple Garden, and then after that, a lot of the green sources are going to sometimes come into play tapped. You also get to play Faceless Haven, which this is the Alchemy nerfed version of Faceless Haven, which is a little bit sad. I think certainly Faceless Haven was not a card that needed to be nerfed in Historic. It's been nerfed because of its power level in Standard. Hopefully, the Arena team either decides to get rid of the nerfs in Historic, or at a minimum, when this card rotates out of Standard, they'll just put it back to being a 4/3 in Historic, which that's a long time in the future, but still something that could happen. The other thing is, because you're not playing 4-drops, you don't have to play as many lands. And because you're not playing Collected Company, you can play more 1-drops. Collected Company, when you hit 2 1-drops, is always a little bit disappointing. But for an aggro deck, generally your best starts are turn 1, you play a 1-drop. Turn 2, you play 2 more 1-drops. Especially when you're playing with a card like Thalia's Lieutenant. You just want to have a lot of creatures in play as fast as possible. So that's why I like White Weenie. Let's go over some of the individual card choices. Esper Sentinel, staple of Historic, just great card. One thing to note is this is a Ranger-Captain of Eos deck. I've got 4 copies of that, which that's a card that sometimes in the white-green versions, they don't make room for 4 of. A lot of times they do. But I've got a package of things to search for with the Ranger-Captain. I've got 2 Dauntless Bodyguards. Okay, 1-drop, really nice if you wind up protecting something later on in the game. 2 Giant Killers. I think Giant Killer is pretty excellent, both as just a cheap 1-mana play. It's not completely embarrassing. But if you're searching this up off the Ranger-Captain of Eos and then killing some creature your opponent invested a lot of mana in, it is absolutely great. 2 Hopeful Initiates, which is a card that most Historic decks don't play, but I think in straight up White Weenie, it's very strong. There's actually a lot of things that you can wind up destroying with the Remove 2 Counters ability that's very appealing. I think that one of the decks you really want to focus if you're trying to build a competitive Historic deck is you want to be good against green-black food or Jund food, any of the food archetypes where they're going to be playing Witch's Oven and Trail of Crumbs, and this is a card that gives you an ability to destroy either of those cards. 4 Thraben Inspectors, kind of standard in any White Weenie deck where it's a legal card. Then moving on to the 2-drops, this is where things get a little bit more interesting. There was Thalia's Lieutenant and Thalia, that's pretty standard. I've got 3 Containment Priests in my main deck, and this is another thing you get to do if you're not playing Collected Company, because this is a card that hoses Collected Company. It also hoses Cauldron Familiar, it hoses Arclight Phoenix, and it partially hoses the new card Inquisitor Cleric. So this is one of the new cards from Alchemy that is certainly a good card in Historic. The Containment Priest obviously doesn't stop them from getting the 3/3 Vigilance, but it stops the card they seek from going into play. Where does it actually go, though? Seek 2 cards with mana value 3 or less, put one of them onto the battlefield, and shuffle the other into your library. So what will happen is they'll be required to try to put one of them into play, and then Containment Priest will cause it to go into exile. So you actually both prevent them from getting the creature in play, and you remove one of the cards from their deck. So if they're run the bubble of the 20 or more creature cards between graveyard, hand, and library, you're actually reducing the count that's left in their deck. That is extremely unlikely to matter, but the fact that they just don't get to put the creature into play for free matters a ton. So that's one of the payoffs for being mono white. Then there's 2 copies of nerfed Luminarch Aspirant. The nerf is that instead of putting the counter at the beginning of combat, it puts it on at the end step. That is a huge nerf to this card. Before, I was playing 4 of it, and I was very happy to play 4. I thought it was the best 2-drop in the deck. Now I'm not even sure if it's playable. This is a little bit of a test to see how much does the nerf really hurt it. One of the best possible starts for any white weenie deck in Historic was always turn 1 Esper Sentinel, turn 2 Luminarch Aspirant, put a counter on it. You can still do that play, but you're going to miss out on 1 damage. Basically, this nerf means roughly you're going to miss 1 damage for each turn that the Luminarch Aspirant is sitting in play. It's not exactly that because you don't necessarily get the damage the first turn you cast it unless you can put the counter on a 1-drop. But sometimes you also miss more than 1 damage if not being able to put the counter right away means you don't even get to attack at all, whereas otherwise you would have gotten to attack. So the nerf is costing you roughly a damage a turn for as long as this is in play, which that is a massive, massive nerf. That said, this was a great card before. It might still be good enough. I'm splitting the difference between 2 of this card and 2 of this new card, Sigardian Evangel. This is a really weird card, but it does give you something to do with your mana as you're flooding, because for every 2 mana you spend, you get a 3/1. It also taps something. It actually makes copies of the card, not tokens, which doesn't matter really for this deck at all, but it does matter in some other decks that would use the card. But basically, this is you're sort of hoping to get 2 3/1s out of this and tap 2 other things to push through some damage. So I think this is a strong card for sure. I don't think it's as good as pre-nerf Luminarch Aspirant, but maybe it's better than post-nerf Luminarch Aspirant. We're going to have to play some games to see. I already went over the Skyclave Apparition. Then the rest of my 3-drops, this is something where you have to choose your 3-drops based around what kind of decks you're expecting to play. I have 2 Elite Spellbinders in my deck. I think that's if you're expecting to play more blue decks, you would want to do this. Maybe that's not exactly the right way to be building your deck right now, but that's what I'm going to play today. 3 Adelines. Adeline's another card that you wouldn't see 3 copies of if you were playing with Collected Company. You might see 0 to 2 copies of it. Really, really strong card. Also really, really synergistic with Thalia's Lieutenant. If you have a Lieutenant in play, and then you play an Adeline, the Adeline coming into play, puts the counter on the Lieutenant. Then the Lieutenant attacks. That triggers the Adeline. It makes another human. That means another counter on the Lieutenant. Also, if you just have Adeline first and it gets to attack and the tokens are sticking around, then obviously the Lieutenant will buff them if it comes into play later. So these 2 cards pair very, very well together. Only 1 Skyclave Apparition. This deck is light on removal in the main deck for sure. It's just focused on creatures. I think if you're going to play like one of these white exile cards in Historic, you 100% should be playing Skyclave Apparition over Brutal Cathar. If you want more than 4 Skyclave Apparitions, that's when I would look in Brutal Cathar. The reason for that is that Brutal Cathar, I think, lines up horribly in the format. If you think about playing against Blue-Red Phoenix, one of the cards you're going to want to exile is a Dragon's Rage Channeler. They'll have 4 Unholy Heats in their deck, plus additional burn spells. The Brutal Cathar is not going to stay in play, nor is the Skyclave Apparition, potentially. So they're going to get their card back, or they're going to get an Illusion token. The Illusion token is going to be way, way worse for them than getting their card back. The only upside of the Brutal Cathar is it's a human, which has a very minor synergy with Thalia's Lieutenant. And occasionally in really long games where people don't have very good draws, the Brutal Cathar will flip and then flip again, and you'll get to exile a second thing. I don't think that makes up in any way for the fact that you're getting to permanently get rid of the thing that you exile with the Apparition, and the downside of giving them back an Illusion isn't that big of a deal. The same thing is true if you play against Cat Oven. Cat Oven, you can exile their ovens. They're going to be able to kill the Brutal Cathar. I mean, the Brutal Cathar can't even hit the oven or Trail of Crumbs to begin with, but this guy can also hit the Squirrel. It can hit Mayhem Devil, And if you get the Squirrel or the Mayhem Devil off the board, they're not coming back. They're going to come back as a token. The token is way more easy to fight through than the card that they actually put in their deck. So I would say just don't put Brutal Cathar in your deck unless you already have 4 Skyclave Apparitions. So that's the main deck. I only have 1 Skyclave Apparition in the main deck, but I've got 3 more in the sideboard. And you'll note that I have no copies of Brutal Cathar. Going over some of the other cards, I've got 4 copies of Portable Hole. It's an excellent removal spell. It's great against like a Cat Oven deck. It's great against White Weenie deck. Just excellent. 4th, Containment Priest. As I mentioned, Containment Priest fits really well into the current historic meta, I think. 2 copies of Rest in Peace. That's really just an anti-Phoenix card. 2 copies of Divine Smite, which is a card that doesn't see a ton of play. I wanted a card that could kill Corval the Mayhem Devil. That's why I'm playing with Divine Smite. Occasionally you'll play against like mono black vampires or something, and this is a great card there too. 2 Gideons, just to have a threat you can put into play that doesn't die to sweepers in case you're playing against like a control deck that is going to have Wrath of God or Anger of the Gods. This is another nice aspect of not playing Company. When you play Company, you have to be really careful about how your sideboard is constructed to make sure you're not removing too many of your good hits when you sideboard. So it's hard to put a card like Gideon Blackblade in your sideboard because it's not a Company hit and it's a 3-mana card. So you run the risk of either having too high of a curve or not enough Company hits if you're trying to put Gideon Blackblade in your deck post-board. No Company here, so that's not a concern at all. 1 Reidane. I think Reidane is an excellent hoser for any sort of big mana strategy. Like if someone's trying to play Sultai Ultimatum or like one of those Omniscience decks or Mizzix's Mastery deck, something like that. Reidane's obviously going to be great against that. And then, like I said, 3 Skyclave Apparitions. So that's the deck. Let's go ahead and jump into some games. Perfectly fine hand. So I have a choice here. Do I want to lead on the Initiate or the Inspector? I think I might lead on the Inspector. And then next turn I'm going to play the A-Luminarch Aspirant almost definitely. And that means that when the Initiate comes out, there will probably be a big enough card out for it to start training. Delver deck, okay. This is another one of those spots where Skyclave Apparition is just so much better than Brutal Cathar. Because they're very likely to have cards in their deck that can kill a Brutal Cathar. The Skyclave Apparition will get to, take out the Delver when I want it to. And it won't come back as a Delver. It'll come back as a 1/1. Could also just block, to be honest. The Delver's a little bit scary. Looks like I'm probably not going to get the option to block. I'll just go get an Esper Sentinel. It's always hard to know when to sack the Ranger-Captain of Eos. I think pretty clearly now is not the right time to sack the Ranger-Captain of Eos. Or is it? I guess if they discard 2 Phoenixes here, I might actually want to do it. Or if they discard maybe even 1 Phoenix. It's a little bit awkward because I know they have Opt. So if they have 2 instants, sacking the Ranger-Captain doesn't even do anything. Yeah, I can't. Doesn't make a ton of sense for them to have played in that way. They could have led on the opt to try to bait me into sacking the Ranger-Captain of Eos. Unless they're not going to wind up casting the opt this turn. I think this is clearly the wrong order to cast their cards in. Alright, it's going to be a race. It's a race I can maybe win if they only have one Phoenix. Why didn't they attack me? I don't think it's worth trading the Ranger-Captain of Eos for 2 damage here. If I attacked with both of these, I assume that the Phoenix would block the Ranger-Captain. And then the Phoenix will probably come back next turn. Especially because on my next turn, I'll be able to play the Evangel and just tap their blocker. I could have even done that turn. I could have just tapped their 2 creatures and attacked. I think that my hand is strong enough that I wanted to play in a way that means they won't be able to attack me back next turn. So I didn't get a card from the Esper Sentinel, but it was a free thing I got off the Ranger-Captain, and they spent a spell on it, and they spent an extra mana on the spell. That's not a horrible exchange for me. Let's go ahead and force through some damage this turn. I'm going to assume that they don't have any cards like Anger of the Gods or Sweltering Suns in their main deck. And just keep adding to the board. It's kind of weird to put cards like that in the main deck of your Phoenix deck just because it kills all of your own creatures, or most of your own creatures. Okay. They're in danger of getting Delirium and forcing the Dragon's Rage Channeler to attack, which I can't imagine they want to have to attack with this card this turn, so they should probably be doing that in their second main phase. Maybe their thought process is they think they need to get more Phoenixes, but well, they both didn't get Delirium and didn't play any more spells. Okay, so I guess they decided that they were gonna wait until the second main phase to play the Faithless Looting, so they wouldn't have to attack with that. Makes sense. This is going to be a big game. From their perspective right now, it looks like they have some good blocks, but it's not going to work out that way. Do I want to counter on the Bodyguard, or do I want the Bodyguard to be guarding the Lieutenant? I think I want the counter on the Bodyguard. I don't think it really matters what I picked, who I picked to guard. I guess we'll guard the Ranger-Captain. It's going to be my biggest creature. And my turn 1 decision of playing the Thraben Inspector over the Hopeful Initiate finally pays off, because I get to train here, where I think I would have never gotten... I guess I would have gotten to train with the Ranger-Captain of Eos last turn. So maybe it didn't actually pay off. Either way, I got to train once, and that was probably all I was ever going to get to do this game. They don't even have double red, so they can't get their Ox back unless they have a red land in their hand. Alright, so this is, I think, a pretty good matchup. I like Rest in Peace. I don't actually like Skyclave Apparition in this matchup, even though I was talking about how it's better than Brutal Cathar. I think they're both just on the expensive side. I do like Containment Priest. Don't really like Giant Killer. If I know they have Crackling Drakes, having one Giant Killer isn't the worst. I think most people probably have Crackling Drakes. Hopeful Initiate doesn't really do anything. So let's have some portable holes. The holes can hit the Dragon's Rage Channeler. They also might have Sprite Dragon or Smoldering Egg. And this seems solid to me. So the Containment Priest here hits the Phoenixes. It also hits the Ox of Agonis, which they may be boarding out the Ox of Agonis. That's a pretty common card to take out of your deck in sideboarding when you're worried that your opponent will be boarding in Graveyard Hate. Okay. I'm definitely not willing to trade my Esper Sentinel. I think I'm just going to start juicing up my Esper Sentinel. Like, here's a spot where I lost 2 damage this turn because I wasn't willing to trade the Esper Sentinel with the Dragon's Rage Channeler. Okay. They don't have a land. This game is going to be a slaughter. Well, you can't keep a hand like this. This, on the other hand, is a fine hand. Do I want the Evangel or do I want the Giant Killer? I think I'm going to keep the Evangel. That's the kind of decision where, not knowing what you're playing against, you're sort of just guessing. The fact that I have the Ranger-Captain of Eos, so I can go and get a Giant Killer if it turns out I really need a Giant Killer, was the way I decided. Opponent mulled to 5, so they mulled as well. I'll just play the Bodyguard. It's 1 less power than the Evangel. The Evangel gets better later on in the game. Also, I might want to Bodyguard my Sentinel. Probably against a blue-black deck. Well, okay, I can Bodyguard this right now. Let's do it. A little bit weird that my opponent didn't just target the Bodyguard. Which of these two do I want to resolve more? I think it's the Ranger-Captain. So they've got 1 card Foretold. They're a blue-black deck. That's probably Behold the Multiverse. It might be Saw It Coming. I think those are about the only things it could be. Just lead on Adeline and see what happens. They did leave 1 card on top, so that's got to be a pretty good card. The Awful Mastery. Alright. I guess I potentially missed out by not leading on the Sentinel. I didn't want my Adeline to get censored, and I didn't want to commit all my creatures to the board in the event that they wind up just playing a sweeper. Here. I'm going to continue to hedge against a sweeper, but do I want to play Thalia anyway? I think I will. Okay. That certainly worked out pretty well for me. Now we're getting to see kind of the power of the Evangel. Obviously, they probably need a sweeper to get back into this game, and I'm just going to play 3 creatures after they play a sweeper. From 1 card. I would guess this is a Torrential Gearhulk deck, so that's probably going to be something to bear in mind this turn, or maybe next turn. Or maybe next game. I guess it doesn't... It's not going to matter this turn, certainly. Maybe next turn, certainly next game. You can use the Evangel to tap lands. So I could actually tap all of their lands if I wanted to. 6, 7... The Evangel actually kills them. Because it puts counters on the Lieutenant. So let's... see if this resolves. I don't think I even could see that they had a card foretold. Not that it matters. So blue-black control. I think I definitely want the Gideons. Probably don't want Skyclave Apparition. I don't actually have a ton of stuff for this matchup. I guess Reidane is fine too. Want the Giant Killers. What's worse, Containment Priest or Hopeful Initiate? They're both pretty stinky. I guess I'll split the difference. I don't think the ability... I guess the ability on Hopeful Initiate does matter against the Gearhulk, so let's not split the difference. Let's just play all Hopeful Initiates. Being Flash and being 2 power matters some, but I think just being 1 mana is probably better. There's definitely way more upside on the Hopeful Initiate. Drawing both of my Giant Killers was not ideal. See if they have another sensor. And this time they can afford to pay. I'll just get a Thraben Inspector. Get the guaranteed card. Is there a reason not to let this go to exile? I assume it doesn't really matter either way. They could have Cling to Dust in their deck, and they could exile a creature from my graveyard to gain life, but I think I'm never gonna run out of creatures in my graveyard if that's what happens. I guess I could also have Commit to Memory, so I'd rather have it shuffled it back into my deck if somehow the memory and I don't wind up losing. I think I messed up not cracking this clue first. Well, let's, I guess, just play out some more little creatures. Hopefully their plan is to try to Gear Hulk me next turn and not to just play Languish. I boarded in my Gideons, right? Oh, it's supposed to be showing me what I sideboarded in when I do that, but it never does. I did board in my Gideons. You're lying to me, Arena. They're not in my sideboard. I will have an indestructible giant killer. Is this guy a human when he's big? He is. They're scrying main phase. Not a good choice. Guess we'll just go with the Evangel. Makes the Lieutenant so much better next turn. This is definitely a good card. The knock against it, I would say, is that it's a 3/1 body, which a 3/1 body in a world where people are playing Cat Oven is going to be underwhelming at times.
Prepare for battle.
Point of life for me. Ooh.
Another day.
I'm thinking about that one. Maybe I should have left more in the tank for post sweeper. Do I want to play the giant killer as well? I think I don't want to. I think I need to keep this for the Gear Hulk. They've got to be a Gear Hulk deck, right? This is a 2-turn clock, which probably isn't going to be good enough, but you can hope. We have Bantu's Last Reckoning. I haven't seen that card in a long time. So this is worth a 2 power. Next turn I'm attacking for 4. Or I could be attacking for 6. I think I'm going to hold this still. That's not good for me. I probably lost this game on like the third or fourth turn when I walked my spells into their counters. 2 sensors rather than playing 2 spells. Because as it turned out, they just didn't have a sweeper for actually a pretty long time. Has holding this thing for the Gearhulk all this time paid off finally? I think it may have. I can also hopefully initiate the Gearhulk. Surprised I didn't play a removal spell. One, two, three, four, five, 6, 7, 8 lands. So if I Evangel 3 of the lands pre-combat, I'll know whether or not a Gearhulk's coming. They could also wind up just Archmage's Charming a Hopeful Initiate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lands untapped. Is that right? It's so hard to tell with these Bordeaux cards. Alright, I'm going to attack with everything. I think they have not enough mana to play a Gearhulk. No, I'm certainly going to attack now. They're down to 1 card. Looks like they're scrying in their upkeep, so they probably don't have a Gearhulk in their hand. And they're going to be down to 5 untapped lands, so unless this card's a land, a Gearhulk doesn't help them. They went bottom, meaning I might be good. Alright. I didn't expect to win that game after the Shadow's Verdict. There's a decent amount of resiliency in White Weenie.